In death, George's darkness lingers, haunting even the shadows. His battle didn't end on the battlefield. It began at home. Gunny George Murdoch was a seasoned soldier with 20 years of experience. He had many scars on his body, including a noticeable one running from his left eye to his mouth, a reminder of an explosion 2 years prior. He sat holding his driver's head while watching him lose consciousness. Their vehicle had flipped over and was now on fire nearby. They were in a group of 3 trucks, and the first one hit an explosive device, causing a tragic accident. In the chaos, George pulled his driver, Simon Wilcox, from the vehicle after it was struck by a rocket. Simon was badly injured. George quickly applied a bandage and gave him pain relief, thankful that Simon was unconscious and not feeling any pain. Help arrived after a brief fight, and an Apache helicopter took care of the threat from a nearby building. Unfortunately, by the time they got Simon to safety, he had passed away. Later, when they returned to their base, George learned from his commanding officer that because of the heavy losses, they would be sent home early. This news brought relief to the men, as their deployment was supposed to end a month later. They boarded a plane and landed back in the U.S. at 2:30 a.m. Gunny made his way to his home. His wife, Jill, whom he had been married to for 12 years, was not expecting him until much later. At home, she was in bed with another man when George entered. He left his bags by the door and went to the bedroom. When he saw Jill with another man, he felt a rush of emotion. He turned on the lights and shouted, startled by the scene before him. "George, what are you doing here? I can explain!" Jill exclaimed, clearly shocked. George confronted her about the situation, expressing his hurt. Jill responded, "You leave me alone for months. What did you expect?" At that moment, George remembered the painful image of Simon and the sacrifice he made. In his overwhelming sorrow and anger, George acted without thinking, and the situation escalated suddenly. Jill started to scream, so Gunny pulled her close and covered her mouth. She fought against him, but soon went quiet. He looked at the 2 still forms and felt nothing inside. After cleaning himself up and putting on his army clothes, he packed a couple of backpacks and loaded them into his truck in the garage. He gathered as much food and water as he could find and put that into his truck, too. Then, he got his service weapon and a rifle along with all the ammunition he could find. Leaving things as they were, he went into a spare bedroom to get some sleep. The next morning, Gunny checked to make sure he had everything and left. At the gate, the security guard waved him through. He didn't have a plan, just a strong feeling that he needed to get away quickly. He thought he had a few hours before anyone discovered what happened. So he drove for 3 hours before stopping. He continued for another half hour to the nearest town, where he changed into civilian clothes but kept his army gear for later. He then went to a used car dealership and traded his truck for an old Ford pickup and some cash. Feeling tired, he drove until he could barely keep his eyes open and parked at a campsite to sleep in the cab. Gunny drove deeper into the forest, looking for a good place to leave the truck hidden from view. He found an old logging path and followed it until he could park far into the woods, covering the truck with branches and leaves. From now on, he would travel on foot. As night fell, he set up a simple camp and settled in for rest. Back at the base, his absence was noticed during the morning meeting, but his commanding officer thought nothing of it since Gunny had been out late. However, when his officer hadn't heard from him by the afternoon, he sent a sergeant to check on him. When the sergeant arrived and found the door open, he entered the house calling for Gunny. It was silent, and after searching the downstairs and upstairs, he discovered the still forms. He felt no sympathy for them, but knew he needed to report what he found. An hour later, a search began. Gunny, used to discomfort, found it easy to sleep on his bed made of ferns. He dreamed about a friend he lost and returned home to a woman who didn't understand what he did. He woke up feeling angry, thinking about how many service members risk their lives for those who are unfaithful. As he lay there, dark thoughts filled his mind, and he decided to make those who betrayed their partners understand the seriousness of their actions. In his mind, he began to think of a plan. Over the next few months, he started to carry it out. He would walk deep into the forest, set up camp, and then head back to town. On the way, he would stop at a campsite to clean up and then go into town to find a bar. He would choose a quiet spot and observe the other people there. It was easy to notice when women were interested in meeting someone, but he would only pay attention to those wearing wedding rings. He would approach them, offer to buy a drink, and chat for a bit. When he felt they trusted him, he would ask about their rings. If he believed they were not faithful, he would invite them back to his place. Once outside, he would lead them to a secluded area, lean in for a kiss, and then do something terrible to them. In his mind, he was helping the husbands by getting rid of someone he thought was untrustworthy. After a few of these acts, he would pack up his camp and move to a new town. In total, he harmed 12 women over 9 months. One night, as he was about to hurt someone else, the woman managed to surprise him by pulling out a weapon and said he was under arrest. 2 officers appeared from either side. In a panic, he grabbed the weapon and started to threaten them. The officers shot at him and he fell down, injured. One of the female officers checked to see if he was alive and called an ambulance. Though he was rushed to the operating table, he did not survive. But what happened next was eerie. A dark presence seemed to rise from his body and linger in the corner of the room, aware of its past self but confused about its surroundings. It remained there for several days, waiting. 3 months earlier, in the same town. Timothy West was sitting at his desk at Johnson Engineering, where he led the engineering department. His job was to make sure any problems with their products were handled quickly, whether at the factory or on dash site. He had sent Carl Johnson, the owner's nephew, to fix an issue in Penton, a 6-hour drive away. Carl and his team of 2 mechanics had been working there for 3 days and were on their way back after resolving the problem. The company made compactors ranging from small home versions to large machines that crushed cars. When one broke down, it quickly affected productivity, so fast and reliable service was essential. This specific machine had failed just 2 weeks earlier, and Carl had assured them it was fixed, only for it to break down again 10 days later. When Sam, the owner, called Tim into his office, he informed him that the machine had failed again, and the company insisted that Tim go and sort it out personally. Tim didn't like arguing, so he agreed to go away for a few days. He called Chris to tell her he had to cancel their dinner plans. Chris was upset and said she would go out anyway because she didn't see why it should ruin her fun. After hanging up, Tim felt sad and wondered what happened to the loving wife he once knew. Timothy West was 32 years old. He had done well in school, earning a master's degree in engineering and a bachelor's in computer science. He was average in height at 5'9" inches and weighed about 150 pounds. He wasn't good at sports, but he was smart, with an IQ of 150. Though he had never been in a fight, he had been hurt a couple of times. Tim stayed fit by going to the gym twice a week and was considered good-looking by many women. His true passion was his wife, Christine, and fixing up old cars that insurance companies thought were too damaged to repair. Christine, his wife of 9 years, was also 32. She had a nursing degree and worked at the local hospital 3 days a week. She was 5'4" inches and weighed 110 pounds, with a figure that turned heads and a smile that brightened any room. He hadn't seen that smile in a long time. Christine enjoyed looking nice, working out every day, and spending money. Most of it came from Tim, as she kept most of her earnings in her own account. Tim paid for everything: her car, maintenance, fuel, rent on their big house, and all the household bills. He also contributed to a joint account that she used for shared expenses. They got married right after college and started in a small apartment, hoping to save money for a home. Chris wanted to keep their finances separate and often avoided talking about her income, insisting they have one joint account where she never added any money. When they announced their engagement, Christine's parents pulled Tim aside for a serious talk. He thought it would be a warning to treat their daughter well, but it was more than that. They cautioned him that he was marrying a self-centered woman who might take advantage of him. They noted that she could spend money quickly and that her mother thought she was very messy. Despite the warnings, Tim went ahead and married her, quickly realizing that her parents were right. She often spent all the money by the middle of the month and complained about being broke. She left her things everywhere, and Tim found himself constantly putting away her clothes and cleaning up after her. Her car was a mess, with receipts strewn on the floor for Tim to tidy up every week. On the bright side, they had a strong, intimate connection, and they would often share special moments almost every night, with longer times together on the weekends. Tim really wanted to have kids, but Chris wanted to wait, so they waited 2 years to start their family. Tim had a job as a supervisor at Johnson Engineering and was earning a decent salary with added bonuses. He decided to save some money in a private account because he knew Chris would spend it. He hoped to keep it for their future children's education and didn't tell Chris about it. Before Chris would agree to start a family, she wanted a bigger house. They didn't have much savings because of her club memberships, car payments, and social activities. So they decided to rent. They found a nice 3-bedroom house with a garden in a safe area that had a shared pool, barbecue facilities, and a gym. Chris didn't want to switch gyms because all her friends went there. Tim usually gave in to her wishes because he was more on the passive side. At work, he was called Little Tim by many of his co-workers who did not take him seriously. They saw him as someone easy to push around. He rarely argued or stood up for himself. Chris stopped taking birth control, and they tried for a year to start a family but were unsuccessful. Tim went to the doctor for tests and found out his sperm count was normal, so it wasn't him. Chris chose to see a different doctor, and when she came home, she was very upset and said she couldn't have children. Tim comforted her as best as he could, but she became more withdrawn. This affected their intimacy, which dropped from almost every night to once a week or even less. She also started to argue over little things and, about 6 months ago, began to belittle Tim in front of friends and family. Tim just accepted it, as he often did. It was no surprise when he agreed to go help Carl with a problem his team couldn't fix. When Tim got home to pack a bag for a couple of days, he noticed the messy breakfast dishes still on the table. When he went to their bedroom, he found clothes strewn everywhere from Chris trying to decide what to wear. He quickly cleaned up and washed the breakfast items before packing his bag. As he drove to his hotel, he thought about the past few months of his marriage. It all began at a company barbecue when Chris met the new head of the legal department, Troy Sims. Troy was a former NFL player who had to retire due to a knee injury. Everyone noticed him for his tall and strong appearance. Tim felt uncomfortable when Troy called him Little Tim right to his face. Standing on tiptoes, Tim pretended to look around and shouted, "Where's Little Tim?" He was right next to Troy. Then he acted surprised and said, "Oh, there you are. I didn't see you." Everyone laughed when Tim turned red and walked away. Troy just chuckled and said, "It's just a joke, little buddy." Some people in the office didn't find it funny. The head of HR talked to Tim and offered to give Troy a warning for how he acted. Tim just said it was fine and not to worry. The BBQ on the first Saturday of June was when things took an awkward turn. Tim and Chris parked, and as Tim stepped out, he saw Troy and his friends at the bar. Chris pointed at Troy and asked who he was because she thought she recognized him. Tim explained who Troy was and said that he and Troy didn't get along because Troy was rude. Chris wanted to meet Troy, so they walked over to greet Mr. Johnson, the owner. Troy spotted them and called out, "Hi, Timmy. Is that your sister? She's too pretty to be your wife. Ask her if she'd like to go out with me someday." There was a moment of shocked silence, and then Troy added, "Just kidding. No offense, pal." His friends laughed, but what upset Tim the most was that Chris giggled too. He felt his face get hot as he walked over to introduce Chris to his boss. Samuel told Tim not to worry about Troy and that he'd talk to him later. Sam's wife, May, apologized for Troy's behavior and said he was just a typical jock. Tim was uneasy about getting drinks since Troy and his friends were right next to the bar, likely ready to embarrass him. Luckily, Chad Foster, the head of HR, noticed what happened and brought over some drinks. He stayed for a bit, complimenting Tim on his work and what he brought to the company. Tim then asked Chris if she wanted some food, so they headed to the hog roast trailer. The line was long, so it took a bit of time. When Tim looked back for Chris, she was missing. He thought she might have gone to the restroom, but after a while he started to worry. May came over and asked if something was wrong. When Tim shared his worry about Chris, one of the wives at their table mentioned she saw her walk away with Troy and pointed in that direction. Feeling anxious, Tim hurried to find them, followed by May. He walked around some bushes and saw them standing close together, talking quietly. When Chris noticed him, she stumbled over her words. "Hello, honey. Troy was just showing me the view over the lake. Isn't it beautiful?" "Yes, very nice," Tim replied, sounding a bit annoyed. "What are you trying to say?" Calm down, Timmy. We were just having some fun. It's no big deal, Troy said, grinning. We're leaving now, Tim said, taking Chris's arm. She pulled away and replied, Stop acting like a child, I'm staying. Well, I'm going. I'm sure you'll find a way to get home. He walked toward the car. May watched. If you care about your marriage, you better go after him and say sorry. And went after Tim. May turned to Troy, saying, You better stop that smirk if you want to keep your job and stop bothering other people's wives. The BBQ is over. Troy knew better than to argue. His job depended on her. Chris reached Tim at the car, but instead of opening the door for her, he got in on the driver's side. Tim usually opened the door for her, and she could see how upset he was. Once they got home, Chris began speaking as soon as they stepped through the door. What was that all about? He was just being... Get along, and you laughed when he teased me feel. My own wife laughing at me? Then while I was getting food, he took you behind the bushes. We weren't doing anything wrong. We were just talking. You were talking too quietly and too close, and you know it. It doesn't matter what you think happened. Others saw it too, including my boss. Now, I told you he's not a good guy, but all you could see was a faint... Or we'll have to rethink our relationship. With that, Tim went into his office and closed the door. Chris stood there, shocked. Tim had never spoken to her like this before. Things were tense around the house for the next week. They only spoke when necessary. One evening, Chris sat down with Tim and apologized for her actions. She promised to make it up. Felt new, and they eventually fell asleep in each other's arms. Tim woke up first and went to start breakfast. While cooking, he reflected on the events of the night before. Although things had been good between them, Tim felt there was something important missing that they used to share. He went to work thinking about it. He wanted to surprise Chris by taking her out for lunch. He told his assistant Tina, a caring woman who often reminded him of his mom, that he might be late returning from lunch. When he arrived at the hospital, he asked the staff at the front desk to page Chris. A nurse informed him that she had already gone to lunch with her husband. Tim asked what he looked like, already guessing the answer. The nurse described him, and his heart sank. It was Troy, someone he didn't trust. Tim thought he knew where they were and decided to check. When he got to the diner, he peeked through the window. They were sitting across from each other, talking like old friends. He quietly took a couple of photos, but was relieved to see they weren't too close, so he left without a word. Later that evening, after changing his clothes, he asked Chris about her day. Oh, just the usual hospital stuff, nothing special. He mentioned he wanted to surprise her for lunch, and she looked uneasy as she replied, Sorry, I got called away. He nodded, saying, It's okay. I went out with some friends instead. Let me know next time. The evening continued on as normal, with no affection exchanged. The next day, Tim waited across from the diner to see if Chris would arrive, and sure enough, she was there with Troy again. He followed them back to the hospital and felt disturbed when she kissed Troy on the cheek to say goodbye. He managed to take a few more photos. That evening. After dinner, he asked her about her day, receiving the same usual response. When he inquired about lunch, she looked guilty and repeated her story about eating with friends. He stared at her and said, That's twice you've been untruthful in 2 days. What else are you hiding? I'm not lying to you, she replied. That's 3 times now. Want to make it 4? I don't know what you mean, and I don't like being called a liar. I'm going to bed. You can sleep on the couch. Good night. Sit down, he said firmly, surprising himself as he had never spoken to her like that before. I saw you with Troy both yesterday and today. I'm sorry, it was nothing. We just had lunch, she insisted. So you didn't hold hands and kiss? No, of course not. Then who are these 2 people holding hands while walking back, and who is this kissing Troy outside? He slid the photos across the table, and her face fell as she looked at them, and she began to cry. Nothing happened, I promise. It was just a kiss between friends. There was nothing romantic about it. Now you see why I warned you about Troy. He is trying to create distance between us, and it seems to be working. Why are you even hanging out with him? He just stopped by to apologize about the barbecue. He said he was sorry if it caused any problems. He was just being friendly. And the second time? He said he was passing by and thought we could have lunch together, so I said yes. I'm sorry I didn't tell you the truth before. I thought you would misunderstand and get upset like last time. You frightened me. I've never seen you so angry. That's because my wife has never spent time with another man before. Well, I'm not asking you. I'm telling you not to see Troy anymore, or there will be problems. You can't tell me who to be friends with. That's my choice. You don't control me. I will see whoever I want. Then she went to bed and locked the door. The next morning was one of her days off. I usually woke up early to make breakfast and bring it to her on a tray. But this morning I used the guest bathroom for a shower, grabbed fresh clothes from the ironing pile, and left for work. I stopped at Wendy's for breakfast on my way. When I arrived at work, I saw Troy by the coffee machine with some of his friends. As I walked by, he smirked and called out, "How about lunch, Timmy? My usual lunch date is busy today. Want to join?" They all laughed, and one of them even made silly gestures with his hands. I was furious that Chris had put me in this situation, so I called her to tell her what had happened. She just laughed and said they were just joking and not to take it seriously. I sat in my office trying to think and decided that I needed to make an effort to win my wife back from Troy, so I made a reservation at her favorite restaurant for that evening. I called her and told her to be ready by 8. That day also had me driving to fix a machine that should have already been done by Carl Johnson. I found myself wondering who Christine would take to dinner with her, so I called a friend from school days, Harry Price. He was a bit like me, a nerd who studied computers and electronics. Now, he owned a small security company that worked mostly on background checks for the government. He was happy to hear from me. We had kept in touch over the years, so my call wasn't a surprise. When I shared my concerns about Christine, he shifted into work mode. "Okay, I know what she looks like, but can you describe him?" I gave him a good description, and when I mentioned Troy's name, he said he could look for his photo online. I told him I didn't want any information until I got back from my trip, as I didn't want to be distracted. He said he understood and would wait for me to reach out. Things took a turn for the worse when I was about 20 miles out of town on the highway. A truck had a flat tire, swerved, and hit my car, causing me to go off the road and roll down a hill, ending upside down in a ditch. I felt as if I was floating above the operating table. Doctors and nurses surrounded a person lying there, trying to help him. They had already tried a few times to get him back, and this was their last chance. "Clear! Thump! Thump! One more time! Clear! Thump! Thump! No response. I'm calling it. Note the time." As he said this, I noticed another spirit that looked similar to mine. This one was nearly white, while mine was more dark. As we came together, I could feel a connection, and we merged into a gray color. Then it felt as if we were pulled back into the body on the table, and the last thing I heard was, "I don't believe it. We have a heartbeat." I lay there listening to voices that seemed far away. It's a miracle. He was dead, no pulse, and nothing on the monitor. But now he's alive and looking good, though I'm not sure he'll walk again. I drifted off to sleep again. I could see a bright light through my closed eyelids and tried to open my eyes, but they felt heavy, like they were stuck. I think he's waking up. As my eyelids opened, the bright light hurt my eyes. "Mr. West, can you hear me? Croak, croak. Nurse, get some ice chips." I felt a cold, wet sensation on my lips. It tasted refreshing. "Where am I?" "You're in the hospital, Mr. West. Do you remember what happened?" "I was going out on a call. I remember seeing a truck hit the barrier, then nothing. Is my wife here?" "Yes, she's been here since it happened. She just went to get a coffee and will be back soon." "Why can't I feel my legs or move my arms? What's wrong with me?" "I won't lie to you, Mr. West. Your injuries are serious and your back is broken, so please don't try to move. You could hurt yourself more." Just then, the door opened and Chris came in. When she saw I was awake, she placed her coffee down and rushed to my side. I couldn't move my head because it was secured, but she held my hand and kissed me gently. I felt tears on my face and realized she was crying. "Oh, thank goodness you're alive. I've been so worried. You were in a coma for 3 days and they were unsure if you would wake up." I must have dozed off again because when I opened my eyes, I was alone. I pressed the button for the nurse, who came in quickly. "Has my wife gone home?" Yes, Mr. West, but that was yesterday. She'll be back later. Would you like something to eat? No, but I'm very thirsty. The nurse brought me a glass with a straw. I never thought water could taste so good. I closed my eyes again and drifted back to sleep. Chris visited me every day and stayed until the nurses told her it was time to leave. While I was in the hospital, our lawyer came to see me. He told me that the truck that hit me was found to be faulty. He said I should hire a lawyer to get compensation for my injuries. He suggested a friend of his and promised to reach out to him for me. Harry Price, a friend of mine, had heard about my accident and came to visit. He told me that Chris had dinner with a guy named Troy that night and showed me some photos of them sitting together. His investigator had followed them to a nightclub and had more pictures of them dancing. There was nothing inappropriate in the pictures, but it troubled me that she was out with another man without telling me. Harry mentioned that Troy dropped her off at our home and warned me that I wouldn't like the next picture. She didn't invite him in, but gave him a kiss that felt too friendly for my liking. I asked Harry to keep watching her, and he said he was already doing that. He then told me she had lunch with Troy every day since, and had gone out dancing twice more. Each time, the goodbyes included longer kisses. I handed him my house keys and asked if he could set up cameras in our home. He agreed, so I had him write a letter to the security guards at our gate, giving him permission to enter our house without telling Chris. I signed it, knowing the guards wouldn't inform her since I was the only person on the rental agreement. That afternoon, a man came into my room and introduced himself as George Faith, the lawyer my friend had recommended. We talked for more than an hour, and we agreed he would seek damages of $10 million. He was honest that we might only get half of that, but he believed we had a strong case since the accident could affect my ability to walk. I signed a document to hire him, and he left. That night, I waited for Chris, knowing our marriage would hinge on how she reacted to what I had to say. At 6 p.m., she came into my room, right when visiting hours started. We chatted about my condition for a while, then I decided to bring up the important topic. Chris, that night of my accident, you said you were just going out. Did you? No, I didn't feel like it. And do you remember when I asked you not to see Troy anymore? You said you would do what you wanted and it was none of my business? She started to fidget and couldn't look me in the eye. Do you remember? Yes, I'm sorry about that. You just made me upset. I didn't mean it. So you haven't seen Troy since then? No, of course not. I wouldn't go against your wishes. You're my husband. Have you ever heard the saying, 3 strikes and you're out? It's a rule from baseball. If the player misses the ball 3 times, he is out. Okay, but how is that important? Well, you've not been honest with me twice tonight, and if it happens again, our marriage might not survive. She seemed upset and almost yelled, I've never lied to you. Why do you think I'm a liar? I reached under the covers and pulled out an envelope with the photos Harry gave me. First lie, you said you didn't go out that night. I handed her the picture of her having dinner with Troy. She looked at it and gasped, covering her mouth. Then I showed her a photo of her dancing with Troy and she began to cry. Second lie, you said you weren't seeing Troy, but you've had lunch with him every day since my accident. You also went dancing with him twice. Can you explain? I'm really sorry. I promise nothing happened. We just talked. He's not what you think. After your accident, he wanted to check on you and we went to lunch. It felt nice to have someone to talk to and he was very kind. Yes, we danced, but he never tried anything. I didn't tell you because I know how much you dislike him, but he really is a nice guy. Tears were streaming down her face. Think carefully before you answer. Our marriage may depend on it. Have you ever kissed him? I could see her thinking. She knew I had an idea of everything else. Maybe if she hesitated, she could avoid trouble. Yes, I kissed him on the cheek to thank him for being there, but it didn't mean anything. I love only you. 3 strikes, you're out. I showed her the pictures of her kissing Troy in 3 different places. Now, tears were flowing down her cheeks and she was starting to sob. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just felt right and I wasn't thinking clearly. Please forgive me, it won't happen again, I promise. I can't explain how much this hurts our marriage. At the very least, we need to go to counseling to fix this. Luckily, it didn't go further than a kiss. If you had invited him into our home or gone to his place, we would be getting a divorce. If that's what you want, say so now. I don't want a divorce. I love you. And I didn't want a wife who disrespects our marriage, but that's what I have. Tim, I'm sorry. I promise to make things right if you give me the chance. Chris, I don't want a divorce either, but I won't live in a marriage based on lies. This is your last chance. If you see him again, we're done. Do you understand? I promise. Just then, the buzzer rang, signaling the end of visiting hours. Chris came over to me, kissed my cheek, and whispered, I promise. Then she left. I felt drained, both physically and emotionally, so I went straight to sleep. The next day, Harry came to visit. I could see he wasn't happy. He sat down in the chair and looked at me with concern. Tim, I'm really sorry, but I have bad news. Troy came to your house and stayed the night. My heart sank, and tears started rolling down my cheeks. Harry moved closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. Tim, it's not entirely her fault. He slipped something into her drink. The video shows it clearly. Harry, it doesn't matter. She promised me she wouldn't see him again. She put herself in a bad situation, so it's her fault too. Do you have proof of what she did? Yes, but do you want to see it? It might be hard to watch. Not right now, but can you make me a couple of copies? Today is one of her work days, so she won't be home until 6. I need you to do something for me. I gave him a list of tasks, and he assured me he could finish everything before she got home. My phone had broken in the crash, so I asked Harry to get me a new one and transfer my data. I also asked him to pick up a pay-as-you-go SIM card. I borrowed his phone to call my lawyer and ask for a recommendation for a good divorce attorney. He promised to get back to me. Harry left to complete my requests, and I cried for the loss of my wife and my marriage. Christine. Leaving the hospital, I felt terrible. I hurt my husband and damaged our marriage. I went straight home, determined to fix things. I called Troy, telling him I couldn't see him anymore since Tim found out and threatened to leave me. He insisted on coming over to talk, and I caved. I think I secretly wanted to see him again. When he knocked on the door and I opened it, he stepped inside right away. After I closed the door, he took me into his arms and kissed me deeply. I tried to push him away at first, but then I found myself giving in. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't stop. We kissed for a long time before he pulled back and said he was starting to fall in love with me. I was shocked and sat down to collect my thoughts. Troy went into the kitchen and returned with 2 glasses of wine. I said I needed a moment, so I went to the bathroom to gather my thoughts. I needed to let Troy down gently. I loved my husband, not him. As we sat sipping wine, Troy explained that he had been in love with me since the first time he saw me at the barbecue. I tried to brush him off, but I could see how much he cared, and my resolve started to waver. I went to take a sip from my glass and realized it was empty, so I filled both glasses. Troy was crying, telling me how much he cared for me. I sat next to him and wrapped my arm around him to comfort him. A little while later, he looked at me and leaned in for a kiss. I knew I probably shouldn't, but I kissed him back. The kiss led to us touching each other, and things heated up. Troy was feeling adventurous, and we got caught up in the moment. I started to notice how excited we both were. Then he leaned back, and I could see he wanted more, so I moved closer. The moment felt intense, and we both experienced a rush of feelings together. Troy stood up, took my hand, and led me to the bedroom. We quickly got comfortable together and fell asleep afterward. When I woke in the morning, memories of the night flooded back, but strangely I felt eager for more. I gently woke Troy, and we shared a tender moment together. As the morning went on, I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night, feeling both nervous and excited. I had to meet with Tim later that evening and wondered how that would go, but I tried to push those thoughts away. When I called Troy for lunch, he had an appointment, but promised to see me tonight. That left me alone for a while. When I got home, I noticed Tim's truck was missing. Looking around, it hit me that many of his things were gone. His favorite chair was missing from the living room, and the office was empty. It was strange and unsettling. The pictures on the wall were all gone except for the ones of us, which were on the floor, broken. I hurried upstairs to our bedroom, where I found the sheets a mess, and realized what had happened. I opened the closets, and Tim's clothes were all missing. It was as if he had never lived there at all. Feeling anxious, I quickly changed and drove to the hospital. When I arrived at Tim's floor, the nurse stopped me. She said Tim didn't want to see me and handed me an envelope. I tried to get past her, but she wouldn't let me in and said she'd call for help if I didn't leave. I had no choice but to step away. I sat in my car and opened the envelope. already knowing what it would say. I received some photos that showed me letting Troy in, along with pictures of us together in both the living room and the bedroom. There was a note that simply said, "You were warned." I started crying because I knew I had created this situation, and now I had to face the consequences. 3 days later, I was at the information desk waiting for some paperwork when a woman in a professional-looking suit approached me. "Are you Mrs. Christine West?" she asked. I replied, "Yes," and she handed me a manila envelope saying, "You have been served." She took a photo on her phone and walked away. My hands were shaking as I tried to open the envelope. I fumbled and dropped it, causing forms and photographs to spill out. My friends noticed and came over to see what was wrong. When they picked up the papers, they saw images of me with Troy. They dropped the photos on the counter and gave me disapproving looks before walking away. I knew my actions would soon be known by everyone at the hospital. One of the papers was a divorce petition for infidelity, along with a restraining order that kept me from getting near Tim or his home and workplace. I thought things couldn't get any worse. Then, when I got home, I found a letter telling me I had 1 week to move out because Tim had canceled the lease. While I was feeling sorry for myself, my phone rang. It was Troy saying he had been served with a suit for interfering in Tim and my relationship and wanted to know where Tim was. I told him Tim was still in the hospital, but wouldn't be allowed visitors. I asked if he was free for lunch the next day, but he came up with an excuse and avoided it. When I asked if he would come over that night, he said he was busy and hung up. I sat there realizing Tim was right. Troy had come between us, and now I was the one trying to win Troy's affection. I cried for the loss of both my husband and my relationship with Troy. My troubles didn't end there. On my way to work, I tried to pay for gas with our joint card, but it was declined. I used my personal card, which worked, and I knew I needed to check on this later. When I attempted to call Tim, I learned his number was no longer in service. I planned to email him when I got home. The day dragged on, and by the end of my shift, I was relieved. Not only had I not seen Troy, but my friends and colleagues were also keeping their distance from me. The next day, I reached out to the bank and discovered that Tim had taken half of our savings and canceled my card. I arranged to get a new card sent to me. My next call was to the letting agent about the lease. After some back and forth, I was allowed to take over the lease from Tim, but the rent would be higher. I also needed to set up the utilities again since Tim had canceled those too. I realized I would have to be careful with my money moving forward. In the weeks that followed, I saw Troy once or twice each week, but the warmth we once shared was gone, replaced by a partner who was demanding. I wish I could say I was surprised, but honestly, I liked the way he treated me. Unlike Tim, who was gentle and caring, Troy only seemed to care about his own enjoyment. I felt like a toy in his hands, moved around however he wanted. I realized he was very confident, and Tim just couldn't match that. After 3 months, I still hadn't heard from Tim, only his lawyer. I had to hire my own lawyer, and interestingly, Troy helped pay for it. Harry came back to see me and said everything was taken care of and stored away in a facility on the other side of town. He also gave me a new phone with a new SIM. I sent my new number to everyone I trusted, making sure it didn't fall into Chris's hands. Unexpectedly, May, my boss's wife, walked in. "Hi, Tim, how are you?" "Thanks for coming. I'm doing okay, but it could be better." "Tim, I know you've hired a lawyer for your case against the trucking company, and you have our full support. You do realize you can also make a claim against us since you were on company business during your accident. Right now you are receiving full pay and your job is safe. If your lawyer files a claim against us, we will offer a good settlement. We need to go through this process for our insurance, but it won't affect your job." "I really appreciate your help, and I'll mention this to my lawyer," I said. Just then, my lawyer walked in with a short woman in her 50s, whom he introduced as Carol Cobb. May's eyes widened in curiosity. "I'm sorry for the lack of introductions. Mrs. Johnson, this is my lawyer for the case, George Faith, and I hope to have my divorce lawyer, Carol Cobb, as well." May looked at me, raising her eyebrows in question. "I'm sorry, May. I wanted to tell you that I'm going to divorce my wife for being unfaithful." She just looked at me and said, "Who?" "Troy Sims, of course." May nodded and sat down, showing she wasn't leaving. George caught my eye and continued speaking. He went to the hall to bring in 2 more chairs for Carol and himself. George updated me on how my claim was progressing. Once he finished, he excused himself and left. Carol asked if I had any proof of Chris's unfaithfulness. I told her I had some photos and a video, but I was still waiting for the video. She asked to see the photos, and I handed them to her. As she looked through them, May stood behind her and gasped softly. Then both Carol and I were surprised when May shouted, "That untrustworthy person is trying to take advantage of a man's wife while he's in the hospital, and she's not doing any better either. I'm going to fire him first thing tomorrow, and then I'll make sure she loses her job too. I support the hospital where she works, so it's time for some payback." "Wow, she was really angry," Carol said. "Can you wait a bit before doing anything? If she loses her job, Tim might have to pay a lot more money. But if she works and can take care of herself, he might not have to pay anything at all. And if he decides to take action against Mr. Sims for stealing his affection and she's not working, it will get thrown out. It may lead to nothing serious, but it could embarrass him. Once the divorce is final, you can fire him and her too." May agreed to hold off for now. She said she had to leave and kissed me goodnight before going. Carol asked me some questions and if I could show her proof of Chris's income and our finances. She also gave me advice on how to protect my money. I asked if I could get a restraining order against her, and she agreed. Then she asked when I wanted to send her the divorce papers. I said as soon as I could, but at her job. I explained what I had done and planned to do, and she said it was all fine since only my name was on the rental agreement. The next day, I called the renting agent to end my lease right away. I also asked if there were any ground floor apartments available nearby. He told me he had one in a secure area, just 2 miles from where I lived now. He wanted to know why I was leaving, so I shared a short version of my story, and he agreed to give Chris an eviction notice the next day. I paid the deposit and the first month's rent. Next, I needed to handle my finances. I called the bank to pay off my credit cards and closed the joint account, but they said I had to do that in person. So, I just paid off the cards and canceled them. Then I opened a new account just for myself. I called Carol to tell her about the joint account situation, and she advised me to empty it except for $1, which I did. Later that day, the doctor came to see me, and after some scans and x-rays, he said the swelling had decreased and he was ready to operate. The surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. When Tim woke up on Tuesday, he was surprised to see May sitting in a chair with a magazine. He tried to talk, but his voice was very weak. May heard him and called a nurse, who brought him some ice chips to suck on. After he had some, he asked May why she was there, and she said that since he had no one else, she thought she would be there for him. When he tried to laugh, his back hurt so much that he nearly fainted. He thought he could feel something in his feet, but he couldn't move them yet. He looked down and saw that his body was covered in a cast from his neck to his hips. He was on a special bed that tilted, allowing him to eat regular food instead of the baby food he had been getting. He was grateful to May for being by his side and felt emotional when he realized he had no one else. Slowly, he fell back to sleep and dreamt of being in a desert, feeling confused and overwhelmed. He woke up sweating, unsure of where he was. The nurse entered the room when she noticed his heart rate had gone up. She asked if he was all right. "Yeah, just a bad dream," he replied. "Now that you're awake, the doctor will want to see you. I'll call him." She left the room, and soon the doctor came in. "Mr. West, the operation went better than we thought. Your spine had already aligned, and there was only a little swelling. To be honest, I've never seen anything like it. I just fitted a plate to help your back heal. If you keep improving like this, you should fully recover. I suggest you go to one of our rehabilitation centers. How does that sound?" "Sounds good to me. When can I leave?" "You could go tomorrow if you want. I'll arrange an ambulance for you." The next day, he was taken to a small clinic 50 miles away to learn to walk again. When they took off the cast, he started doing many exercises to help his back. The doctor, who had done his surgery, came to check on him. "Mr. West, you're quite the surprise. When you were brought in, you weighed 125 pounds. After being less active, you should have lost weight, but now you weigh 155 pounds with strong muscles. That's unusual. There's also something else. It looks like you are developing a scar from your left eye to your mouth. Have you been hurt there before?" "No. Could it be from the crash?" "There's no record of an injury there, so probably not. We'll keep watching it. The good news is that you are healing faster than we expected, so I plan to remove your stabilizing plate tomorrow. You could be out of here in the next 2 weeks." During this time, Harry kept him updated on Chris. After he had her removed from the hospital, she went home and cried a lot. She received a notice to leave the house but managed to keep the lease in her name, so she was still living at their old place. Harry also told him that Troy was often visiting and sometimes stayed the night, enabling him to gather plenty of evidence for the upcoming divorce. But he did say that all the video recordings from when she took over the lease wouldn't be allowed in court. He also mentioned that she had stayed at his place a few nights. I asked him if he could watch Troy's place, and he said he could, but it would be against the law, and we could get in trouble if caught. I told him I only wanted the information for myself and wouldn't share it with anyone else. He agreed to see if he could set up some recording devices and promised to let me know. I thanked him for helping me move my things into my new apartment, and he joked that I owed him a beer dot. After I got better, I was finally taken out of the clinic and picked up by Harry, who brought me to my new apartment that I had never seen before. We parked next to my truck in the secure underground garage and went up to my new home. As soon as I walked in, I was met with a loud shout of surprise. Some of my co-workers were there, led by May, who hugged me tightly and whispered, "Welcome home." There were also a few people I didn't know, but I later found out they were part of a welcome committee from my apartment building. I noticed a nice-looking redhead and thought I'd like to get to know her. May and Harry had finished setting up the apartment for me. It had everything I needed. My computer was set up and a new TV was on the wall. I was so happy that I started to cry and hugged everyone. I had thought I was alone, but I was actually surrounded by friends. The next day, I made an appointment to see my claims attorney in the afternoon. He told me that the truck company offered me $3 million, but he believed he could get at least $5 million if I waited. I agreed to that. He also told me that May had talked to him after he filed a claim against Johnson's. After some negotiation, they agreed to pay me $1.3 million and keep me on as the head of engineering. He accepted their offer on my behalf, and the check was put into a separate account that my wife wouldn't touch. As I drove around my new neighborhood feeling happy to explore, I looked for shops, restaurants, and other places. I spotted a gym and suddenly wanted to join, so I parked and walked to Sam's gym and MMA training. When I stepped inside, I smelled sweat, lotion, and leather. It was an old-style gym with free weights, a boxing ring, and several leather punching bags. There was also a large area for sparring. While I was standing there, a man came over to me after leaving the sparring section. "Can I help you?" he asked. "Yeah, I'm thinking about joining a gym to get stronger. I've been sick lately and need to get in shape," I replied. "Sure, we can definitely help with that. Come into the office and we'll talk." That was how I started my journey into MMA. I trained hard for 3 months. I ran, lifted weights, swam, and practiced different martial arts. By the end, I had built my body into strong muscles, weighing 180 pounds. I felt confident in the ring. I had a plan and told my friend Sam about it. He thought it would be funny and wanted to help. We talked over a drink, and at one point he said, "All right, Tim, now that we're friends, tell me the truth. Were you in Special Forces?" I promised him. "Sam, I swear on my mother's memory, I've never been in the military. Honestly, before coming to your gym, I had never been in a fight." "Well, Tim, from the first time I saw you, it was clear you had talent. Your fighting skills seem like those of someone who has trained their whole life. You must have been really tough in a past life." Going back to when I first moved in, I joined a gym and decided to run to and from it as part of my training. One evening as I was coming home, I saw a young girl, about 8 or 9 years old, sitting outside an apartment down the hall. I remembered a girl with red hair from my party and thought this could be her sister. I walked over to her and asked if she was okay because she looked a bit worried. She said she had come home from school, but her mother wasn't there as she usually was. I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just leave her alone. It wouldn't be right to ask her to come into my apartment by herself. I didn't know many people in the building except the security guard. I knocked on a few doors, but no one answered. I asked her if she had a phone to call her mother, and she said she had tried to call and left a message. I suggested she come with me to talk to the security guard downstairs, and she agreed. When I explained the situation to the guard, he said they had a plan for this and called the police. When they arrived, we all went to my apartment to talk. That's when I learned her name was Amanda, and her mother's name was Lindy. I offered Amanda some milk and cookies, which helped her relax a bit. During our conversation, she told me that she and her mom lived alone, but her mom was always home when she got back from school. The police officer tried to contact social services for help, but they said no one would be available for several hours. They then asked to speak with Amanda. They wanted to know if she had a babysitter, where she lived, and if she knew her babysitter's phone number. The babysitter lived one floor up, so we decided to visit her. She agreed to take care of Amanda until we could find her mother. I brought the police officer back to my apartment. He began by checking with Amanda's mother's workplace. She worked as an accountant for a small engineering company. They confirmed she left work at her usual time to get home to Amanda. The police officer then asked if they could see if her car was still in the parking lot, but it wasn't there. They told him the make and model of the car, but they didn't know the license plate number. He quickly found the plate information and issued an alert for it. Next, he called the hospitals and found out that a woman matching Lindy's description had been found unconscious in an alley. The officer there thought it was a robbery that had gone wrong. There was no sign of her car, and no personal belongings were found. We went to the babysitter's house and explained what had happened. She agreed to keep Amanda overnight. The officer said he planned to go to the hospital, and I asked if I could go with him after I changed my clothes. He seemed a bit annoyed, but said it was fine. When we arrived at the hospital, they took us to her room. I noticed it was a ward with 6 beds. I asked why she didn't have a private room. They said they didn't know if she had insurance, so they put her in a public ward. I went to the front desk and requested to speak with the administrator. When she arrived, I asked her to move Lindy to a private room with all the care she needed. I offered to sign any paperwork to take responsibility for the costs. Their attitude changed right away and things started to move quickly. The police officer looked at me in surprise. "How well do you know this woman?" he asked. "Actually, not very well," I replied. "But she's my neighbor and I want to help her." A doctor came in to talk to us now that we were in a private area. He explained that Lindy had received a blow to the head and might not wake up for several hours or even days. The officer took some notes and said he was leaving. He asked if I wanted a ride, but I said I would stay for a while, so he left. I went to the gift shop, bought a couple of magazines, and settled into a rather uncomfortable chair for the night. The next morning, the doctor came in to check her charts. He lifted her eyelids and looked at her pupils with a flashlight. Just as he was leaving, she moaned, and he quickly returned to check her vital signs. While he was doing this, she opened her eyes. "Where am I?" she asked. "You're in the hospital. Do you remember what happened?" "Yes, 2 men dragged me out of my car and one of them hit me. I can't remember anything after that." "You're in good hands. We'll let the police know you're awake, so expect a visit." "I can't stay here. My daughter will be worried sick." I stood up. "She's okay. The babysitter is looking after her." "Who are you?" "I feel like I know you." "You welcomed me when I moved into my apartment. I'm your neighbor, remember?" "But how did you—" "Shh, just rest. I'll bring Amanda to see you tonight. Is there anything you want me to bring?" She gave me a list, and I left. When I got back to my apartment, I took a quick shower, changed my clothes, and then went to the babysitter's to pick up Amanda. I told her that her mother was okay, but in the hospital. Amanda had a lot of questions, but I didn't have many answers. The sitter had a spare key to Lindy's apartment, so we went there, and Amanda filled a bag with the things on Lindy's list. Amanda had taken the day off from school for a family emergency, so there were no issues. She wanted to change her clothes, so I went back to my apartment to wait. When she came to get me, she looked so sweet, just like a 9-year-old can. She had even tied her hair back the way her mom liked it. Since it was still early to visit Lindy, I took Amanda to McDonald's for a little dinner. She seemed really happy about that. Afterward, we took our milkshakes to the park, fed the ducks, and chatted. I learned that Lindy was divorced and that her ex-husband had left the country. No one knew where he was, and he hadn't reached out to either Lindy or Amanda. He also hadn't paid any support for their family. I was surprised by how much I could learn from a 9-year-old while we enjoyed our milkshakes. When we arrived at the hospital, Lindy was sitting up and reading one of the magazines I had brought. Her face lit up when she saw Amanda, and they hugged for a full minute. Lindy told Amanda that she had an accident but was recovering well. They kept Lindy in the hospital for a week while she healed. I picked her up on Friday morning and took her home, but she still needed to rest for at least 2 more weeks. She didn't want to go to bed, so I insisted she relax on the couch. I went to the kitchen to make some coffee, and when I came back, she was gently snoring. Amanda was due back home in about 2 hours, so I started preparing a meal for them. When Amanda came running in, she shouted, "I'm home!" She quickly noticed her mom was asleep. Lindy didn't wake up, so Amanda came over to me and gave me a hug. There's something special about a child's hug that made me feel emotional. She looked up at me and said, "Thank you for taking care of us. I really like you, and I think my mommy does too." I finished making dinner, which was macaroni and cheese, salad, and ice cream for dessert. Amanda woke Lindy with a soft kiss and said, "Dinner is ready." Lindy smiled at me and said, "Thank you. You didn't have to do all this, but I really appreciate it." I served dinner on 2 plates and started to leave, but they insisted I join them. After dinner, I helped Amanda with her homework, and after watching her favorite movie, it was time for her to go to bed. Lindy started to get up, but Amanda said she wanted me to put her to bed and read her a story. I looked at Lindy and she nodded in agreement. I told Amanda to get into her pajamas and let me know when she was ready. I went to her room and opened the door carefully. She handed me her favorite book. I turned to the marked page and began reading. About 10 minutes later, her eyes closed, and she fell asleep. I marked the page and placed the book on a shelf. Before I left, I did something I never thought I would do. I leaned over and gently kissed her forehead. As I turned to go, she mumbled something in her sleep. "Love you, Tim." I froze, not sure what to think. I was certain she was asleep, so she probably didn't even realize what she had said. When I sat down across from Lindy, she asked me what was wrong. I told her what happened, and she just laughed, saying Amanda had already told her how she felt. I didn't know what to say and sat there, still trying to process everything. It was getting late, so I cleaned up the dinner dishes and was about to leave. When I opened the door, Lindy was standing there beside me. She leaned in and gave me a soft kiss on the lips. "That's to say thank you for everything you've done. We really appreciate it." I returned to my apartment and closed the door behind me, still feeling her kiss on my lips. Over the next few weeks, we grew closer. We had dinner together often, sometimes at their place, and sometimes I took them out. Whenever we were at their apartment, I would read Amanda a bedtime story until she fell asleep. Afterward, Lindy and I would sit and talk until it was time for me to go. One night, during one of our chats, I told her about the tough times I'd been through, and by the end, I had tears in my eyes. I also admitted that I knew part of her story, as Amanda had told me while we were feeding ducks. Lindy found that hilarious and agreed with me that you should never underestimate a child. We kind of started dating, but Amanda was always with us. We even went to Disneyland, Florida for a long weekend, staying in separate rooms, of course. Amanda was starting to feel like the daughter I never had, and Lindy and I grew very close. Still, I was afraid to take things further and risk ruining everything. One morning, there was a knock on my door. Lindy and Amanda were there, and Lindy asked me to come over for dinner that night. She mentioned that she needed to discuss something with me, which made me feel uneasy. I looked at Amanda, who just giggled. That evening, I knocked on Lindy's door. She called for me to come in. She was wearing a housecoat and gestured for me to sit down across from her. Then came the words I had been dreading. "We need to talk." My stomach dropped, and I thought about leaving, but as I stood, she asked where I thought I was going. I admitted that I thought she wanted to end our friendship. "No," she said. "I want to know why you haven't even tried to kiss me. I know you're not avoiding me, so what's going on?" I blurted out. "No, it's not that at all. You're everything I could ever want. I just didn't want to make you uncomfortable or push you away." She smiled and said, "I'm glad to hear that." Tim felt his heart race as he stood in the room with Lindy. She smiled softly and took his hand, leading him to the bedroom. The room was quiet, and the air felt heavy with anticipation, but it wasn't rushed. They shared a few tender moments, and as they grew closer, the connection between them deepened. They kissed, their embrace filled with warmth and care. Tim lay beside Lindy, gently holding her as they talked, sharing their thoughts and feelings. They exchanged kisses and soft touches, each one more tender than the last. The night passed with a sense of closeness and understanding, their bond growing stronger. As they drifted into sleep, Tim wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. The next morning, the smell of breakfast filled the air. Tim woke up, feeling content and at peace. He got up, showered, and walked into the kitchen in his boxers. Lindy was cooking, wearing her house robe. They exchanged a shy glance, and she blushed slightly. Tim walked over and gently hugged her. "Do you regret anything from last night?" he asked softly. Lindy smiled, shaking her head. "No, not at all. Do you?" "Never," he replied. "It was one of the best nights of my life, and you're an amazing woman." They shared breakfast together, enjoying the calm of the morning. Afterward, they headed out to pick up Amanda, ready to continue their day, stronger and more connected than ever before. It was a Saturday, so there was no school or work. We took Amanda to the cinema to see the newest Frozen movie. Afterward, we went to McDonald's for lunch. While we were enjoying our milkshakes, Amanda asked me in her little girl voice, "Are you going to be my new daddy now?" Lindy and I almost choked on our drinks, but I answered, "Would you like me to be?" "Yes, more than anything. Can he, Mom, please?" I said, "Amanda, you're putting Tim in a tough spot. We haven't even talked about it yet." "I'm sorry, Tim. You must feel awkward." "Actually, I'm thankful to Amanda. I was too shy to ask you myself." "So, in answer to your question, Amanda, I would really like to be your new daddy if your mommy agrees." We both looked at Lindy, who seemed emotional but nodded and squeezed my hand. "Yes, yes, and yes," she replied. "Amanda, this is your fault, so you'll have to come with us ring shopping." Amanda jumped up and accidentally knocked over my drink. "I promise to be the best daughter ever," she declared. We spent the afternoon ring shopping. We found a small jewelry store that had a variety of engagement rings. I noticed Lindy gazing thoughtfully at some antique rings. When she asked to see a selection of reasonably priced rings, I requested to see the ones she had been looking at. I told her to choose one without worrying about the price. She picked a beautiful diamond ring surrounded by small rubies and tried it on. It fit perfectly. I told the shop assistant we would take it, and Lindy kissed me happily while Amanda giggled beside us. Once we got home, Amanda insisted on showing the babysitter, Mrs. Ross, Lindy's new ring. Mrs. Ross seemed thrilled for us and asked when the wedding would be. I explained that I was in the middle of a divorce, so I couldn't make any plans just yet. That night, after Amanda went to bed, Lindy and I cuddled on the couch. I mentioned that I would be going back to work next Monday and that my boss was excited to see me again. The next day, I visited Harry. He said he had a lot to discuss. I arrived at his office just after 10. He sat me down and started a video. True to his word, Harry had installed cameras in all of Troy's rooms. He mentioned he had hours of footage, but that wasn't the main topic. As the video started, I noticed Chris wasn't in it. Instead, it showed Troy in his basement, which he had turned into a nice hangout space with a bar and some friends. I recognized one of them as Carl Johnson. They were chatting about Chris. Carl said, "That girl you have is something special. When do we get to hang out with her?" Troy replied, "Soon. I've been helping her relax a little each time we meet so that she'll want me around." I can't believe how foolish she is. Tim told her not to see me anymore, but what does she do? She calls me and asks me to come over. So I went to meet her. I pretended to be sincere and poured her a drink. By the time we finished, she seemed very interested in me. We've been seeing each other regularly since then. She just can't get enough and keeps asking me to come over. Man 1. So what's the plan? Troy. The usual. I want her to move in with me after the divorce. Once she gets her settlement, it should be worth a good amount, and then I can take advantage of her. She mentioned having a life insurance policy. If something happened to her partner, she would get a payout. We could set up a situation like before, and then I could benefit. Harry paused the video. Tim, I know this is about your divorce, but we need to involve the law, even if this video can't be used as evidence. I contemplated for a moment. What if I could get Troy to confess to his plans on tape? Would that help? Yes, that would work, but how will you get Troy to admit to his wrongdoings? I have a plan. I'll use his arrogance against him, and in return, I will get my revenge. Just leave it to me. I then gave him a list of tasks. My next call was to Sam to arrange a meeting for a personal dispute next Friday. I told him that I would send more details later. Then, I called May to let her know I could return to work on Monday. She agreed and asked if I wanted Troy and Carl fired before then. I told her to hold off because I had a plan for them. I explained what I had learned about their intentions, and she was shocked and upset, asking what I intended to do about it. I assured her I would clarify everything on Monday. I arrived at work early on Monday to set things up. I placed a recording device under my desk and a small camera on the bookcase. I got to work on my tasks as the office started to fill up. My assistant, Tina, was starting her computer when she saw me. "Oh, Mr. West, it's great to see you. Are you back for good?" "You look great, and yes, I'm back for good." At that moment, I saw Troy heading to the coffee machine, followed by Carl and some of their friends. I decided to approach Troy, who looked at me with a smirk. "Hello, Timmy boy. How's your wife?" he said, earning chuckles from his friends. "I wouldn't know. She's with someone who takes advantage of people while they are down." Rewrite the provided text using simpler, more common words and terms, aiming for clear and straightforward language while maintaining a narrative storytelling tone. Remove sexually gratifying content. Remove any words, phrases, or situations that could be perceived as sexually suggestive or intended for sexual gratification. Remove detailed descriptions of violence and murder, scenes involving guns, weapons, torture, and the consequences of those violent actions, and replace them with subtle sentences to retain the main content. Completely remove all 18-plus scenes, including undressing, having sex, and any content violating policies on explicit material. If the passage contains scenes of violence, abuse, or torture, tying hands and feet, removing underwear, describing bathing, descriptions of removing pants, taking off shirts, sexual descriptions, obscene positions, defamatory words, dirty words, insulting human dignity or sickness, completely remove them by euphemizing and shortening them as much as possible. Replace the 18-plus content with equivalent but as subtle as possible. For example, have sex plus undressing equal sign, make love. Replace them with similar situations expressed in a more neutral manner to avoid violating community guidelines on sexual content. This entails breaking down complex vocabulary and concepts into more accessible language suitable for someone with an intermediate level of English fluency. The rewritten text should avoid using words that go beyond basic English and ensure that sentence structures are simplified, using short sentences and words with fewer syllables wherever possible. The aim is to convey the same story and emotional tone as the original, but in a way that's easier to understand for readers who might find complex language challenging, while keeping the word count consistent and alternating sentence lengths for ease of reading and maintaining the storytelling mode. This is the text that needs to be rewritten. "Oh, but you knew that already, seeing as you're the lowlife." There was a sharp intake of breath, and Troy went to come at me, but Carl held him back, saying, "Don't not here, there are witnesses, we'll take care of him later." I looked at Troy and laughed. "Don't they call you the bear? If so, that makes me a terrier because I intend to bait you every chance I get until you stop hiding behind your friends." "Well, what about it, Troy boy, up for a bit of one-on-one, or are you too chicken?" "I'm gonna fucking beat you to death, you little weasel." "Words are cheap. Is that all you've got? You're just a bag of wind." "I'll tell you what, why don't we settle this in the ring, just you and me? You can even bring some of your friends to give you courage. And just to make it interesting, why not have a little bet on the side? Anytime, any place, you name it. And just what is the bet going to be? Let me guess, if you win, you get your wife back." "Fuck no, I don't want her. She's damaged goods. I wouldn't touch her with yours, let alone mine. No, if I win, I get your car and your house with everything in it plus $20,000. If you win, you get my truck, the SLK Merc, $20,000 and this." I held up a voice recording device, Troy said. "And what the fuck is that supposed to be?" "Come into my office and we'll talk about it. You too, Carl. It concerns both of you, something about Denver, Vegas, and Hector." They both turned white and nodded. I walked towards my office, and they followed like two lost puppies. When we got into the office, I sat down, but they had to stand as I had removed all the other chairs. I played the recording for them, and saw then turn an even whiter shade of pale. "Okay, boys, you know what this is, don't you?" "Well, don't you?" "Yeah," in unison. "So let me get this straight. You find a suitable woman, worm your way into their affection drug, then abuse them. Then you convince them to divorce their husbands and clean them out. You then increase the drugs and get them dependent so that you and your friends can gangbang them. Then when you're finished with them, you sell them to a pimp in Vegas called Hector, who puts them on the street. Tell me, is that what you do?" You know it is so. What are you going to do about it? Just one more thing. If the husband is worth more dead than alive, you arrange a little accident. The insurance pays out and you do the same as before with the woman. And that is what you have in store for me. And Christine, isn't it? Yeah, but now you found out what's it going to cost us for your silence. Well, if you meet me in the ring as suggested and you win, this recording will be given to you along with the rest of the bet. Do we have a deal? Yeah, and I'm going to beat you in that ring, you fool, and I might also take your wife away. Oh, and Troy, just out of curiosity, what happened to that guy in Denver? He slipped off a bridge while walking his dog. But you were going to have another car accident, and you might still... Now that we understand each other, you two can get back to work. Please, leave. I turned off the recording devices and shared the details with Harry. Then I took out the flyers I had made earlier, inviting everyone to the fight and showing the address. I called my lawyer Georg to help with the terms of our bet. On the night of the fight, my lawyer and Troy's lawyer would get our signatures, and each would keep the other's client's deeds and a check for $20,000 for their opponent. Friday evening came, and I waited for Troy to step out of the dressing rooms. I was already in the ring, sitting in my corner, wearing a robe with the hood up. Troy emerged in a similar robe, lifting his hands like he was already a winner. He climbed into the ring, did a few fancy moves, and threw some jabs into the air. He tossed his robe to Chris, who caught it with a smile. I felt a brief sting of sadness. Rising, I tossed my robe to Lindy, who had insisted on coming to watch. I noticed Christine's expression change, and a look of anger crossed her face. We faced each other, like a bear and a small dog. I wore tight shorts that ended above my knee, fighting boots and gloves. Troy had on traditional boxing shorts and boots along with his gloves. I had just gotten a short haircut, and with my scar, some said I looked tough. Without my robe, my muscles were visible, and some of my co-workers pointed them out. Even Chris was watching me closely, and some of Troy's supporters appeared nervous about their choice. The referee stepped into the ring. There will be no rounds. The fight continues until one fighter can no longer go on. It will stop only if someone is knocked out. There are 2 rules: no biting and no gouging eyes. Other than that, anything goes. He called us to the center of the ring and checked our gloves. Return to your corners and come out fighting when the bell rings. Ding, ding! We moved towards each other, circling around. Troy made a quick jab, which I dodged easily. I smiled and asked, "Is that all you've got?" That really made him mad. He swung wide at me, and if it had hit, it would have been over for me. I was ready and ducked as he came at me. Then I stood up and pushed his elbow, making him lose his balance. I kicked his legs out from under him, and he fell hard on his side. I walked to the other side of the ring and, using my best cartoon voice, joked, "Did the big bad bear fall down? That's too bad." The crowd was either quiet or whispering to each other. Troy got up, looking very angry, which was just what I wanted. He stopped pretending to box and shouted, "I'm going to get you!" He then charged at me like he wanted to grab me. I stood still with my arms up so he couldn't catch me easily. He wrapped his arms around me and lifted me off the ground, yelling, "Now you're done!" I quickly clapped my hands over his ears with all my strength. He let me go and stepped back, holding his head. I stepped in and hit his ribs a few times, then hit him in the chest. He dropped to his knees, still holding his head. I grabbed his wrist and twisted his arm behind his back. He cried out in pain. I pushed him down and put my foot on his back. I held onto his wrist and asked, "Do you give up?" When he didn't answer, I made it worse for him, and he finally said, "You win, no more." I asked one last thing. "Who's the strongest now?" He replied, "You are, please." I let him go, and when I looked over at Chris, she was sitting in her chair crying. My side of the ring was cheering, and Lindy smiled at me, giving me a thumbs up. I climbed out of the ring and walked over to 2 men in dark suits. "He's all yours, gentlemen." They both laughed, and one said, "Yeah, we'll take him to the hospital." Troy couldn't move and had to be carried to the ambulance. Carl tried to leave but was stopped by a couple of police officers who handcuffed him and took him away. Next comma. I went to my attorney, who had seen the whole thing. He was busy collecting our bet. Troy's attorney didn't seem too upset about giving up the papers for Troy's car and house. My attorney handed me the keys, and I gave the house keys to a locksmith waiting to change the locks. Sam came over, shaking my hand. That was amazing. You took down Goliath in front of everyone. People will remember this for a long time. I might even sell the video. Then Lindy came over to congratulate me with a hug. May approached next, and I introduced her to Lindy, saying, "This is my future wife." May invited us to dinner soon and then left. As people began to drift away, many came over to pat me on the back. Even some of Troy's crowd apologized for how he treated me. The next day, I received a text from Chris asking if I could meet her at our old house. I replied that I would go, but I would bring Lindy with me. We arrived at the agreed time and went inside. Here's how the conversation went. Chris was sitting at the dining room table and looked very upset. "I asked you to come here to say I'm sorry and to explain my actions." "You don't need to explain. You made a mistake and now you have to face the consequences." "It's not just that. When you gave me the divorce papers, I showed them to Troy. He said he wanted to marry me after the divorce, but now he has been arrested. I have nowhere to stay. I can't keep this house anymore. I only held on to it to remind me of you, but you've moved on. Before you continue, you need to hear this. I recorded something shortly after you received the papers." I played her the recording of Troy and his friends talking about her situation. When it ended, Chris suddenly ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife. Before we could stop her, she harmed herself. I quickly took the knife away and wrapped her wrist in a towel to stop the bleeding. Lindy called 911, and we held a very upset Chris until the ambulance came. I went with her, with Lindy following behind. When we got there, I asked for her to have a private room and gave the nurse my insurance information. After surgery, Chris was still unconscious, and the doctor asked if I was her husband. I explained we were getting a divorce, and he said they wanted to keep her for observation. I called Chris's mother to tell her what happened. She said she would come as soon as she could. I stayed with Chris until her mother arrived and told her everything. She said Chris was making poor choices, but did not deserve to suffer like this. I agreed and said I would help with all her medical bills. She thanked me, and I left. A couple of weeks later, while I was back at work, Chris's mom called to say Chris had tried to take too many sleeping pills. She had been hiding them at the hospital but was caught by a nurse. She was moved to a psychiatric hospital near her mother where she would receive therapy. I thanked her for letting me know and ended the call. Epilogue. Troy was found guilty of serious crimes and received 3 life sentences to serve consecutively. He would spend his life in prison. Carl received the same sentence. Their 3 friends were each sentenced to 25 years to life for their involvement in the crimes. Hector was sentenced to 20 years for human trafficking and organized crime. Chris attempted to harm herself again and was taken to a mental health clinic where she had a breakdown and ended up in a facility for mental health treatment. Lindy and I moved to a new 4-bedroom house and are excited to welcome our second child in 5 months. Life is finally looking good.